Welcome to the Marshall Pruett Podcast, presented by the Justice Brothers and Cooper Tires. We're here at Daytona recording a catching up with episode with someone who I know you kind of smile and maybe it makes you feel a little bit uncomfortable, but for you, Mitch Bishop is IMSA royalty, son of IMSA founders John and Peggy Bishop. So in addition to being IMSA member number 6, I believe it was? 006. Yes. You have this
These days you can't put the zeros in front because it just truncates to 6. But
you have an amazingly beautiful book, which I ordered the moment that I found out it was available, put together by yourself, our dear friend Mark Raffauf, who we had on the podcast not too long ago, talking about IMSA, specific date range, though, from its founding in 1969 through 1989. Those who have the book or have bought it know the answer to this, but to those who don't, why that very specific era, knowing that we're here at Daytona starting the celebration of IMSA's 50th anniversary?
Well, yeah, that's a great question to start off with. So the 69 is easy. That's when IMSA started. We had our first race in October of 1969 on the 5/8 mile oval at Pocono.
Formula Ford race, I believe?
Formula Ford race. Our first idea was to race Formula cars on ovals, which turned out to be a bad idea. But 1989 is also easy. That's the year that my parents sold the business to Andy Evans and Mike Cohn. So
this, and we're going to come back to the book, and I should also tell our dear listeners, this isn't a plug. This isn't a paid anything. This is because the idiot who founded this podcast, Marshall Pruett, genuinely has bookshelves with motor racing publications that at times have gotten so heavy I have heard loud crashes in the night. Not a joke, because the bookshelves have failed because they're so packed with racing books. So this is just my own passion. IMSA and sports car racing books happen to be just about at the top of that passion. And when I heard a while back that you and Mark were working on this, I already told my wife, sweetheart, I don't know what it's going to cost. Just know that you're going to see something in our account debiting. It's here. What kind of reaction have you gotten to this book that's, 2 inches thick? I mean, I don't even know.
So it's about 380 pages, about 370 photos, high-quality production. It's a coffee table book, let's be clear. But the thing that makes this book, I think, different from all the others is that it's got inside stories that have never been told before, not just on my family side, but also on the professional side through Mark and his activity through the years. You know, how did the turbos come into the series? Why did we switch from Formula Fords to GT cars in 1971? You know, what was the behind-the-scenes story about Group C versus IMSA GTP? That's all in the book, and much else, you know, obviously much more than that. But we really tried to tell a story from start to finish and tell it from the inside. Unfortunately, the books that have been published about IMSA history or the magazine articles, they're all okay, but they contain a lot of factual errors, and they don't have the context that people need to understand, even the context about how did my father get into motor racing and to begin with. And his years at the SCCA, where he led the charge on the US RRCC, the Can-Am, the Trans Am. I mean, he led them into the professional racing world from 1962 on, when he assumed the role of executive director. So all that inside story is told as well. But it goes back even further. My father's life was really just kind of a metaphor for the greatest generation. He served in the Navy during World War II, took advantage of the GI Bill to go to college. He could never have imagined going to college. He, like my mother, grew up in a Depression family, got an industrial design degree, and it just so happened that one of his classmates was into sports car racing and invited he and my mother to the 1950 Watkins Glen race through the streets. And that was the beginning of the rest of his life. Their life literally changed that day. And my father was enthralled always with mechanical things, mostly airplanes and locomotives. But on that day, he became very interested and intrigued and curious about the engineering, if you will, the technical aspects of marrying high horsepower engines to European chassis. and the design of those things. And so that's how it got started. So we tried to weave the story just from the beginning all the way through their retirement in Florida after 1989.
So I'm going to bounce around a little bit. We'll come back in just a moment to ask you about some of your favorite stories that are in the book. Why now? Why not in the 90s? Why not the 2000s? Why now for this book? Timing's perfect. Just curious what it was in your life where you said, the time is right, we must start making this happen.
It's actually a great question because there was a moment, and I'll tell you what the moment was. In October of 2014, Jim France asked me to help him unveil the new perpetual trophy called the Bishop France Trophy. It's the perpetual IMSA Champions Trophy. And he had sent a letter to my father earlier that year, and unfortunately my father passed away in June of 2014. But he asked me to come out to New York and help him present it, and which I did. Long story short, we had a great time on stage. Jim hates being in front of a crowd, so he made me do all the talking. But I got back at him by calling him my lovely assistant up on stage in front of 350 people in the audience. But we unveiled the trophy, and afterwards I was mingling with the crowd, and NASCAR had done a very nice little tribute video, about 5 minutes, and multiple people told me that they had no idea how IMSA got started, or they learned a lot that night just from 5 minutes of a nice marketing video. And so that was the moment I said, I got to get serious about writing this book. And I found out that Jim had commissioned an effort that hadn't gone anywhere. The writer had interviewed my parents many hours with Mark, but the tapes were just sitting there languishing. So I quit my job 3 years ago and said, I'm committed, and we got to be ready by the 50th anniversary. That was just happy coincidence that happened, but and here we are in the book's shipping today. So, in
the description of what I wrote for my podcast with Mark Raffauf, I described him as the living embodiment of IMSA, right? And that's not to no discredit of anyone else, but he is a person who, if you look for that through line through history,
it's a thread that's unbroken.
46, I forget.
A lot of years.
Whatever the number is, but almost all of the 50. I'm well known for obvious dumb questions. Why choose Mark as your co-author? I'm sure I'm sure that there are many that others might have said, oh, this person's the definitive IMSA man or woman. What led you to Mark?
Well, Mark and I are family. He said this on his podcast with you, and so I'll say it too. We're brothers from another mother. Yeah. And it's literally true. Mark started working with my parents when he was 16. I was a teenager, too, at the time. And so we kind of grew up together with sort of common parents, my mom and dad. And so that's one of the big reasons. But the other big reason is that none of the competitors really had the inside story of the discussions that went on behind the scenes about why we did certain things or how certain decisions were made about the rules along the way. What were the politics with the FIA at the time of Group C versus IMSA GTP, for instance? Those are very interesting stories that had never been told this way before. And so he was the natural partner in this project, and he still works at IMSA, so he's busy. I did a lot of the heavy lifting, but just interviewing him for me was fantastically interesting because I saw our common experience through a new lens.
It's also incredibly frustrating with Mark to know that he remembers the air restrictor put on the March Buick at this event. And I'm going, how do you know that? Okay, come on, man. I can barely do division or subtraction. How do you have these kinds of things trapped in your brain? But obviously a perfect co-pilot for a book like this. And it's an anthology. That's the other thing I appreciate about this book, Mitch, is it's not a highlight reel. It's not a let me tell you how great we are. It's There are lumps, there are ugly periods that are covered. There's all manner of things that are covered in the book, but it's done with this meant to be something that if you knew nothing about motor racing, much less IMSA, and happened upon the book, by the time you get to the end of it, the end of 89, sure, there's more to learn after, but you could say, I think I got just about everything.
Well, this is how it all started, and you're right. We had lumps and bumps along the way. I mean, in May of 1970, we almost killed a couple of guys at Charlotte in a Formula Ford race on the Big Oval, and that was the turning point, and we went GT racing. There's obviously the sort of the drug smuggling age. We cover that.
What about, I mean, this is one that it shouldn't come as a surprise, but at least to some folks who maybe think the 60s, early 70s was just still the love generation and everyone's cool and happy, learning that the organization your father left, the SCCA, to found IMSA, they were kind of the big dogs. They weren't too happy at having rivals, and maybe were suggesting to tracks where they competed that, hey, you want to let these runts over here play, then you're not going to get us. I mean, they tried to stop it before it started. That
was a curious thing for me. But yeah, I mean, my father left the SCCA in February of 1969, not entirely under his own power. That's covered in the book, and it's a longer story. But here he was sitting at his dining room table wondering what he was going to do next. And because of the success that he had with the Can-Am and Trans Am, there were a bunch of new tracks that were being built. And there literally was not enough sports car racing product to put at all these tracks. And the idea to start IMSA didn't come from my father. It came from Bill France Sr., who called him up 2 weeks later and said, come down to Daytona and let's chat. And so Bill France Sr. put up the money to start IMSA. My dad took on the challenge and was excited about it. And it was truly a family business in every respect. We all worked at IMSA. We lived and breathed IMSA, through my high school and college years. And my brother worked there. And what was interesting, we interviewed probably 25, 30 drivers for this book, and to a person, they all said the same exact thing. IMSA was family, and the racing with a difference was the fact that it was a family-oriented vibe. It was completely different than the SCCA. Even from the start, the SCCA was concerned about IMSA, to the point where they almost forced us to cancel that very first race in Pocono.
Wow. Yeah.
The SCCA had the top products at the era. The Can-Am, Trans Am were arguably at the peak of their popularity in 69 and 70. And so we went formula car racing primarily to avoid them. But what we found out was that there were a lot of SCCA sedan drivers who wanted a place to race, and by the way, race for money, which was kind of crazy idea at the time. And so we went Group 2 and Group 4 rules, created a series, and then we got lucky in about 3 ways. One, we got accepted into ACUS.
Yes.
We took over the sanction of the 24 Hours of Daytona in 1973, Sebring in 73, and those two, the third event was the sponsorship from Camel cigarettes.
Yes.
And those 3 things together put us on the map in 72 and 73. And, of course, this race was not held in 74, nor was Sebring because of the gas crisis. But by the time 75 rolled around, we had 60, 70, 80 cars in the field. It was just nuts.
Got about 5, 6, 7 minutes left before the two of us both have to run here for this episode of Catching Up, brought to you by Cooper Tires and the Justice Brothers. Mitch, let's close with a favorite story or two from the book. And I know we're not giving anything away because, at least by my informal count, there's 947,000 great stories in the book.
And there's so many that we couldn't cover in the book, and it was painful. But I would just point to, there's a small section on Charlie Rainville. And Charlie was my sort of second father. He was our chief steward almost from the start. He taught Mark everything he knows about being a race director and a chief steward. But But Charlie spent a lot of time with us. In fact, he lived in Providence, Rhode Island, but when he was working in the IMSA office, he stayed at our house. And so there's so many great Charlie stories, but I'll tell you, one of them was we always had the attitude of not trying to prevent people from running at the races, but finding a way to let them run. The greatest story that I know about that was that one year, I think it was 76, we were just getting our West Coast races going with fuller fields. We started in 74. But it was a big deal for the East Coast guys to tow west. And at Laguna Seca in 76, Carl Schaefer showed up with his Camaro. And they're standing in the pit lane, and Charlie, who's all of 5'4", and Carl, who's probably a foot taller at 6'4".
9'10", yeah.
They're standing there quietly looking at the car. And Charlie's got his arms crossed looking at it, and he's looking at it, and he says, "Carl, that car doesn't look right." And there's silence. And another minute passes by, and he said, "Carl, did you chop the car?" And he had to fess up at that point. He said, "Yeah, Charlie, I did," in his drawl, his, Ohio drawl or wherever he was from. And so instead of sending him home, Charlie came up with the idea of, he says, "I'm going to make you," turned out it was 4 inches too low. So the roof line, Charlie made him fabricate a metal spoiler that he tack welded onto the top of the car to make it 4 inches taller, which, of course, messed up the aerodynamics tremendously. It was like a boat anchor parachute on the thing. But he found a way to let Carl run that weekend. He towed all the way from the East Coast. And there's a ton of those kinds of Charlie stories in there, but some of which we couldn't put in the book because they're very colorful. But
I think just by sheer coincidence as well, I'm always a little bit confused whether it was 75 or 76, but I think it was 76. That Laguna race was my first race.
Oh, yeah?
At 5-6 years old.
We got some great photos from that race, but I'll just close up by saying that Charlie was the heart and soul of Racing with a Difference, and he actualized the vision in around that tagline with the competitors. And he was so well respected, and that was another sort of piece of the puzzle, if you will, of why IMSA was so successful through the years.
I think I know you also mentioned something that is very key, and hopefully our listeners recognized it the moment you mentioned it. Obviously a bit cartoonish to try and chop the roof and lower it 4 inches on 1 or 2 inches you might get by with. That much, that was probably going to be spotted, and it was. But think about this just from a time and spirit capacity, knowing what you mentioned about how IMSA has been and was regarded by all who competed as family. Rather than say, you broke the rules and or your car is not compliant, time to pack up and head home and drive back across the country, came up with a workaround, acknowledged what was done, came up with a way to honor the fact that this competitor did go all the way across the country. It tells me that IMSA valued people over the rules. And I don't mean at the expense of rules, but to say in modern era, and that's not specific to IMSA, it's to just about every racing series, it is a rule-driven exercise. You broke the rules, you're not compliant, period. The rules are held at the highest value. I love hearing that even in this comical tale you shared, people, the competitors who turned out, who put money in to the kitty to make this series happen, they were prized first, and workarounds were found, if necessary, to keep them involved.
That's a good observation, and I think it's valid. I also think you need to remember that we were also concerned about what kind of product we put on the track. Was it going to be entertaining for the fan? And IMSA fans were entertained from the beginning.
So, Mitch, for those who have not been crazy OCD like me and ordering it the first moment that I found it was available, where can folks get a hold of this seriously awesome, fortify your coffee table, it will break if you don't, IMSA 1969 to 1989 book?
Well, we were very fortunate to be able to work with Octane Press, Lee
They
Clancher.
do awesome work.
Lee Clancher's outfit out of Austin. We chose them specifically because we were very committed to a high-quality product at the end. And so you can go to the Octane Press, so go octanepress.com/IMSA and tell you all about the book and how to order it. It's also available on Amazon now.
Mitch, thank you so much for taking some time, and I hope...
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
I hope folks are receiving you as IMSA royalty, and it's also great to see that the royal family is giving back and giving folks, honestly, something really, really important.
I don't know about the royal family stuff, but it's been exciting to go to this 2.5-year journey and get to this point where we have a finished product, and we're proud of it.